Miss Marple and the Choir Practice Incident. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where mysteries unfold like the petals of a carefully tended rose. I'm your host Connor, and tonight we find ourselves in the familiar comfort of St. Mary Mead, observing the world through the keen eyes of Miss Jane Marple. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Share your location in the comments and settle in with something warm to drink. Our story begins on a cold December evening, where the notes of a beloved carol will soon be interrupted by something far more sinister than a missed harmony. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Thursday evening rehearsal. The church of St. Mary Mead stood solid against the December darkness, its windows glowing warmly as voices lifted in practiced harmony. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her choir robe and cleared her throat gently, preparing for the evening's rehearsal. For 40 years she had occupied the same position in the alto section, third from the left in the second row, a vantage point that provided excellent observation of both the choir and the congregation beyond. Thursday evening rehearsals were sacred in St. Mary Mead, running precisely from 7 until 9 o'clock under the exacting direction of Mr. Geoffrey Blackwell. The Christmas concert was merely 3 weeks away, and Mr. Blackwell had been driving the choir with unusual intensity, his sharp corrections and impatient gestures suggesting a man under considerable strain. Miss Marple had noticed the tension immediately upon arriving that evening. The choir room, normally filled with warm chatter and the rustling of sheet music, felt subdued. Several members were conspicuously absent, their empty chairs creating gaps in the formation that spoke of recent discord. Young Timothy Hartley, who should have been standing in the tenor section, was nowhere to be seen. Neither was Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, whose powerful soprano had graced the choir for 30 years. Mr. Blackwell himself appeared more agitated than usual. He was a man of precise habits and rigid standards, his silver hair always immaculately groomed, his conducting baton held with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute control. This evening, however, his movements seemed jerky, and he'd already paused twice to take throat lozenges from the small silver box he kept in his waistcoat pocket. The rehearsal had proceeded with mechanical efficiency until they reached O Holy Night. It was 8:30 when Mr. Blackwell raised his baton for the piece, his other hand reaching into his pocket for another lozenge. He placed it in his mouth with practised ease, gave the downbeat, and the choir began. They had barely completed the first verse when something went terribly wrong. Mr. Blackwell's baton faltered mid-gesture and his free hand flew to his throat. His face, moments before flushed with the exertion of conducting, turned an alarming shade of red, then began to take on a bluish tinge. The baton clattered to the floor as both hands clutched at his collar. The choir's voices died away in confusion and alarm. Miss Eleanor Wright, the assistant director, was the first to reach him as he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. His eyes were wide with panic, tears streaming down his face as he struggled desperately to breathe. Miss Marple observed this scene with the careful attention she brought to all unexpected occurrences. While others rushed forward in confusion, she noted several significant details. The silver lozenge box had fallen from Mr. Blackwell's pocket and lay open on the floor, revealing a dozen or so medicated lozenges of the type he always used. The box itself bore no signs of tampering, its clasp working smoothly when Miss Wright inadvertently kicked it aside in her haste to help. More interesting was the reaction of those present. Miss Wright had gone quite pale, her hands trembling as she loosened Mr. Blackwell's collar. The organist, Mr. Philip Marsden, had frozen at his bench, his face a mask of shock. The churchwarden, Colonel Bantry, was already rushing toward the telephone in the vestry, calling for Dr. Haydock with admirable presence of mind. In the tenor section, young James Thornbury appeared more puzzled than alarmed, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was witnessing. Beside him, Mrs. Alice Pemberton clutched her music to her chest, her expression one of horror tinged with something Miss Marple couldn't quite identify. Was it fear, or perhaps guilt? Dr. Haydock arrived within 10 minutes, a testament to both his proximity and the urgency in Colonel Bantry's voice. He immediately administered treatment, his experienced hands working swiftly as Mr. Blackwell's breathing gradually became less laboured. The crisis passed, though the choir director remained weak and shaken, unable to speak beyond hoarse whispers. as the ambulance arrived to transport Mr. Blackwell to hospital, Dr. Haydock drew Miss Marple aside. His face was grave and his voice low enough that others couldn't overhear. What he told her confirmed her worst suspicions. This had been no accident, no sudden allergic reaction or natural medical emergency. Someone had deliberately poisoned Geoffrey Blackwell with a powerful throat irritant, and had it not been for the swift intervention, the choir director would almost certainly have died. Chapter 2. The Locked Desk and 5 Keys. The morning after the incident found Miss Marple in her cottage garden, ostensibly tending to her winter roses, but her mind was occupied with far more serious matters than pruning and mulching. The attempted murder of Geoffrey Blackwell represented something particularly disturbing in a place like St. Mary Mead, where the church choir was woven into the very fabric of community life. Dr. Haydock had been quite specific in his analysis when he visited her that morning, accepting a cup of tea and settling into her comfortable sitting room with the air of a man bearing troubling news. The poison used had been a concentrated solution of capsaicin, extracted and intensified far beyond what one might find in even the hottest pepper. Mixed with certain oils, it had created a substance that, when dissolved on the tongue, would cause severe inflammation of the throat and airways. What made the poisoning attempt particularly cunning was the choice of delivery method. Geoffrey Blackwell was known throughout St. Mary Mead for his dependence on medicated throat lozenges during choir practice. He suffered from chronic dryness of the throat, a condition he blamed on years of conducting in draughty churches, and he was never without his distinctive silver box of specially prepared lozenges from the chemist in Much Benham. The box itself presented the first significant puzzle. It was kept in the locked drawer of Mr. Blackwell's desk in the choir room, a heavy oak piece that had served successive choir directors for half a century. The drawer's lock was old-fashioned but sturdy, and Mr. Blackwell had been particular about keeping it secured. He had reason to be, Miss Marple reflected, given what she had recently learned about the contents of that desk. According to Colonel Bantry, whom Miss Marple encountered at the post office that afternoon, only 5 people possessed keys to that desk. Mr. Blackwell himself, of course, kept one on his personal keyring. The vicar, Reverend Clement, held another as part of his general responsibility for church property. Colonel Bantry, as church warden, had been entrusted with the third. The 4th key belonged to Mr. Philip Marsden, the church organist, who occasionally needed access to music stored in the desk. The 5th and final key was held by Miss Eleanor Wright, the assistant choir director. Miss Marple made careful note of these 5 individuals as she went about her daily routine, though she appeared to be doing nothing more than her usual round of village activities. A chance encounter with Mrs. Alice Pemberton at the butcher's shop revealed that tensions in the choir had been building for months. 3 long-time members, including Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher and Timothy Hartley, had been dismissed from the choir just 6 weeks earlier. Mr. Blackwell's reasoning, according to Mrs. Pemberton, had been brutally direct. He'd announced that their voices had deteriorated with age and that the choir's reputation demanded higher standards. The dismissals had been particularly painful because they came just before the Christmas concert, the choir's most important performance of the year. Mrs. Fletcher had sung soprano for 30 years, while Timothy Hartley's father and grandfather had both been tenors in the same choir. But the dismissals were only part of a larger pattern of discord. Miss Marple learned from young James Thornbury, whom she encountered walking his dog past her cottage, that Mr. Blackwell had been increasingly autocratic in his direction. He refused to consider any contemporary Christian music, insisting that only traditional hymns and classical pieces were appropriate for church performance. This had frustrated the younger choir members, several of whom had trained in modern vocal techniques and longed to incorporate new styles. More troubling still was Mr. Blackwell's apparent manipulation of solo opportunities. According to Thornbury, several talented younger singers had been passed over repeatedly in favour of Mr. Blackwell's particular favourites, regardless of their actual vocal ability. The Christmas concert traditionally featured several solo performances, and the selection process had become a source of considerable resentment. Miss Marple filed away these observations while maintaining her usual pleasant demeanour. The village buzzed with speculation about the poisoning, but she noticed that certain individuals seemed more affected than others by the incident. Miss Wright had not attended the usual Friday morning church cleaning, sending word that she was indisposed. Mr. Marsden had been seen leaving the chemist's shop looking troubled, and Mrs. Pemberton had made several visits to the church when she thought herself unobserved. The rehearsal scheduled for the following Thursday presented a particular challenge. How could the choir continue to practice with their director hospitalized and under police protection? The answer came from Reverend Clement, who announced that Miss Wright would assume temporary direction of the choir, with Mr. Marsden providing additional support. This arrangement seemed sensible on its surface, but Miss Marple noted how it placed both keyholders in positions of increased authority and access. As she settled into her evening chair with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the locked desk and its 5 keys. In her experience, when someone was poisoned through such specific means, the perpetrator almost always had intimate knowledge of their victim's habits. Geoffrey Blackwell's throat lozenge routine was well known, but accessing those lozenges required either a key or considerable skill at lockpicking. The question was not just who wanted Geoffrey Blackwell dead, but who had the means to act on that desire. Chapter 3. The Embezzlement Discovered. Sunday's church service proceeded with a solemnity that had less to do with the liturgy than with the empty conductor's podium in the choir loft. Miss Marple observed the congregation with her usual careful attention, noting which members seemed distracted, and which appeared relieved by Mr. Blackwell's absence. The church was unusually full, she reflected, as people often attended more faithfully when scandal touched their community. After the service, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Mrs. Bantry, who had information of a most disturbing nature. Her husband, the Colonel, had been asked by Reverend Clement to review the choir's financial records as part of a routine audit before the Christmas concert. What he had discovered had shocked them both into silence, and they had immediately contacted the vicar with their findings. Over tea in the vicarage that afternoon, a meeting Miss Marple attended at Reverend Clement's specific request, the full extent of Geoffrey Blackwell's betrayal emerged. For at least 5 years, possibly longer, the choir director had been systematically embezzling from the choir fund. The amounts were not large individually, but accumulated over time they represented a considerable sum, somewhere in the region of £8,000. The money had been taken in clever ways that had escaped casual notice. Concert proceeds had been underreported, with the difference pocketed. Donations meant for new choir robes had been diverted to Mr. Blackwell's personal account. Most painfully, funds raised specifically for a planned trip to Canterbury Cathedral, where the choir had been invited to sing at a special service, had been stolen entirely. The trip had been cancelled 2 years earlier, blamed on insufficient funds, when in fact more than enough money had been donated. Colonel Bantry's review had revealed the extent of the theft through careful comparison of bank statements with donation records and concert receipts. Mr. Blackwell had been careful, but not careful enough to fool a former military officer accustomed to reviewing supply accounts for irregularities. The pattern of theft was unmistakable once one knew to look for it. What made this discovery particularly relevant to the poisoning attempt was the timing. 3 choir members had apparently discovered evidence of the embezzlement independently and had been planning to present their findings to Reverend Clement immediately after the Christmas concert. They had wanted to wait until after the performance, not wanting to disrupt the choir's annual tradition, but they were determined to expose Mr. Blackwell's crimes. These 3 individuals were Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, Timothy Hartley, and Mrs. Alice Pemberton. All were long-time choir members with deep connections to the church. All had been deeply hurt by Mr. Blackwell's recent actions, whether through dismissal or exclusion from favoured positions, and all, Miss Marple noted with interest, had strong motives for wanting to see Geoffrey Blackwell removed from his position of authority. Miss Marple's investigation over the following days revealed the depth of feeling these discoveries had generated. Mrs. Fletcher, speaking in the privacy of Miss Marple's sitting room, described how she had noticed discrepancies in the concert receipts after being asked to help count donations. She had begun keeping her own records, comparing them with the official figures Mr. Blackwell reported. The pattern of missing money had become undeniable. Timothy Hartley had discovered the theft through his position as assistant treasurer of the church council. He had access to bank statements and had noticed regular transfers to an account that didn't match any of the church's authorized vendors. Further investigation revealed the account belonged to Mr. Blackwell personally. The amounts were always just small enough to avoid triggering official scrutiny, but over time they added up to a significant theft. Mrs. Pemberton's discovery had been more personal, and perhaps more devastating. Her close friend, now deceased, had made a substantial donation to the choir fund in her will, specifically earmarked for the Canterbury Cathedral trip. Mrs. Pemberton had been executor of that will and had made sure the money was properly donated. When the trip was cancelled for supposed lack of funds, she had questioned the discrepancy, only to be brushed off by Mr. Blackwell with vague explanations about unexpected expenses. These three had compared notes carefully, building a comprehensive case against their choir director. They had consulted with a solicitor friend outside the village to ensure their evidence would stand up to scrutiny. They had planned their presentation to Reverend Clement down to the last detail, intending to give Mr. Blackwell no opportunity to destroy records or create false explanations. But none of them, Miss Marple learned through careful questioning, had access to Mr. Blackwell's locked desk. Mrs. Fletcher had been dismissed from the choir before the poisoning. Timothy Hartley, though still technically a member, had stopped attending rehearsals in protest of his father's dismissal. Mrs. Pemberton remained in the choir, but she had no key and no obvious means of accessing the throat lozenges. This presented Miss Marple with a fascinating puzzle. Three people had powerful motives and definite plans to expose Geoffrey Blackwell, yet none of them appeared to have the means to poison his throat lozenges. The attempted murder required not just motive, but opportunity and access, things these three whistleblowers conspicuously lacked. As Miss Marple sat in her garden that evening, watching the winter sun set over St. Mary Mead, she reflected on the complexity of human nature. Embezzlement was a serious crime, and those who discovered it had every right to feel betrayed and angry. But would any of them have gone so far as attempted murder? And if not, who else knew about the theft and had both motive and means to act? Chapter 4. The Assistant Director's Secret. The Thursday evening rehearsal proceeded under Miss Eleanor Wright's direction, with a competence that surprised many choir members. Miss Marple, resuming her place in the alto section, observed that the assistant director had clearly been preparing for this eventuality, her knowledge of the Christmas programme complete, and her conducting technique more assured than most had realised. Miss Wright was a woman of perhaps 45 years, unmarried and devoted to the church. She had served as assistant choir director for 7 years, always in Mr. Blackwell's shadow, her suggestions politely received, but rarely implemented. Her father, Colonel Wright, had been churchwarden before Colonel Bantry, and she had grown up in the very building where she now led the diminished choir. What Miss Marple found particularly interesting was Miss Wright's habit of arriving at the church well before rehearsal time. According to the verger, whom Miss Marple encountered while arranging flowers on Friday morning, Miss Wright had been coming to the choir room as early as 6 o'clock on Thursday evenings, a full hour before rehearsal began. She claimed it was to warm the space and organise the music, tasks that seemed somewhat excessive given the church's modern heating system and the general tidiness of the choir room. A casual conversation with young Mary Barnes, who cleaned the church twice weekly, revealed more intriguing details. Mary had noticed that Miss Wright often stayed late after rehearsals as well, sometimes not leaving until 10 o'clock or later. When Mary had mentioned this to her mother, curious about why anyone would linger so long in an empty church, Mrs. Barnes had suggested Miss Wright was probably just dedicated to her work. But Miss Marple wondered about a different possibility. Arriving early and staying late provided Miss Wright with unsupervised access to the choir room, including to Mr. Blackwell's locked desk. The question was whether she had the means to open that desk, and if so, what she might have been doing there. The answer came through a series of careful observations and gentle inquiries. Miss Marple learned from Colonel Bantry that his set of keys to church property, including the key to Mr. Blackwell's desk, had been stored in his study at home. His daughter had mentioned to Miss Marple that Colonel Wright, Eleanor's father, had kept similar keys in the same location during his tenure as churchwarden. More revealing was Miss Marple's conversation with Mrs. Wright, Eleanor's elderly mother, during a visit to deliver a jar of homemade marmalade. In the course of discussing various matters, Mrs. Wright mentioned how devoted Eleanor had been to her late husband, Colonel Wright, and how she still maintained his study exactly as he had left it when he died 5 years earlier. The study contained all his papers and possessions, including, Mrs. Wright noted with pride, the keys to every lock in St. Mary Mead Church. This information cast Miss Wright's early arrivals and late departures in an entirely different light. She had access to her father's keys, kept in a house she shared with her mother, She could easily have borrowed the churchwarden's key without her mother noticing, used it to access Mr. Blackwell's desk, and returned it before anyone was aware of its absence. The question was what she had been doing during those unsupervised visits to the choir room. Miss Marple's investigation took a more focused turn. She paid particular attention to Miss Wright during the following Thursday's rehearsal, noting how the assistant director's gaze often strayed to Mr. Blackwell's desk, how her fingers occasionally touched her handbag as though checking for something important, and how she seemed simultaneously relieved and anxious about her temporary promotion to choir director. After the rehearsal, as Miss Marple was gathering her coat and handbag, she deliberately left her spectacles case on the pew. She returned a few minutes later, letting herself in quietly through the side entrance, and discovered Miss Wright standing at Mr. Blackwell's desk with the drawer open. The assistant director was photographing papers with a small camera, her movements quick and practiced. Rather than confront Miss Wright directly, Miss Marple coughed gently to announce her presence. Miss Wright started badly, dropping several papers and turning quite pale. The camera disappeared into her handbag with remarkable speed, but not before Miss Marple had gotten a clear view of what was being photographed. Financial records from the choir fund, showing detailed accounting of receipts and expenditures. Miss Wright's stammered explanation about organising the desk for Mr. Blackwell's return was transparently false, but Miss Marple accepted it with apparent credulity. She retrieved her spectacles case, made pleasant conversation about the evening's rehearsal, and departed, leaving Miss Wright visibly shaken by the near discovery. But Miss Marple now understood what Miss Wright had been doing during those early arrivals and late departures. She had been systematically documenting Geoffrey Blackwell's embezzlement, photographing financial records that would provide incontrovertible evidence of his theft. The question was whether this documentation project had somehow led to attempted murder, and if so, how Miss Wright had progressed from gathering evidence to poisoning throat lozenges. The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay in something more personal than simple financial crime. There had been pain in Miss Wright's face when she was caught photographing those records, a depth of emotion that suggested the embezzlement had struck at something more than just church finances. What had Geoffrey Blackwell stolen that had hurt Miss Wright so deeply? Chapter 5. The Canterbury Cathedral Dream. The answer to Miss Marple's question came from an unexpected source during Sunday's church service. As she sat in her customary pew, she noticed that Miss Wright's attention kept straying to a memorial plaque on the wall near the choir loft. The plaque was relatively new, installed perhaps 3 years earlier, and bore the inscription, "In loving memory of Catherine Wright, devoted mother and choir member who sang with the angels." After the service, Miss Marple made a point of examining the plaque more closely. It was a simple but elegant brass plate, clearly expensive, with musical notes engraved along the border. What caught her attention particularly was a small additional line at the bottom. "Her voice shall be heard in the cathedral she loved." Mrs. Bantry, joining Miss Marple in her contemplation of the memorial, provided the context that made everything clear. Catherine Wright, Eleanor's mother, whom Miss Marple had visited the previous week, was not Eleanor's biological mother at all. She had been Colonel Wright's second wife, a woman some 20 years his junior, who had married him late in life and had been more like a sister than a mother to Eleanor. Catherine Wright had been one of St. Mary Mead's finest sopranos, blessed with a voice that, according to Mrs. Bantry, could make angels weep. She had been the heart of the choir for decades, and her greatest dream had been to sing at Canterbury Cathedral. When the invitation came for the St. Mary Mead choir to perform there, Catherine had been thrilled beyond measure, practicing daily and planning the trip down to the smallest detail. But 6 months before the scheduled performance, Catherine had been diagnosed with cancer. She had fought bravely through the treatment, determined to be well enough to make the journey to Canterbury. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic, believing she might achieve remission in time for the performance. It had become her reason for fighting, her motivation to endure the grueling chemotherapy. Then came the announcement that the Canterbury trip had been cancelled due to insufficient funds. Catherine had been devastated, her will to fight seemingly broken by the loss of her dream. She had declined rapidly after that, dying just 3 months before what would have been the performance date. Eleanor Wright had been with her at the end, watching her beloved stepmother's final disappointment crush her spirit. What made this tragedy particularly bitter was the subsequent discovery that the funds had not been insufficient at all. The money raised for the Canterbury trip had been substantial, more than enough to cover all expenses with room to spare. Catherine herself had made a generous donation to the fund, money she had saved carefully from her modest music lessons and performance fees. Miss Marple learned from Colonel Bantry, who had conducted the recent audit, that Catherine Wright's donation had been recorded in the choir's books, but had never appeared in the bank account. It had been one of the first things to disappear when Geoffrey Blackwell began his systematic theft. In essence, Blackwell had stolen Catherine Wright's dream and, in Eleanor's view, had stolen her life. This understanding transformed Miss Marple's perception of Eleanor Wright entirely. Here was a woman who had watched her beloved stepmother die heartbroken, believing there was no money for the trip that would have given her final months meaning and hope. Eleanor had discovered the truth only later, through her painstaking documentation of Blackwell's embezzlement. She had learned that her stepmother's death had been hastened by a cruel lie, a theft not just of money, but of hope and purpose. Armed with this knowledge, Miss Marple began to see Eleanor Wright's actions in a different light. The early arrivals and late departures at the choir room, the photographing of financial records, the careful documentation of every theft, all of it pointed toward a woman building a comprehensive case against the man who had, in her eyes, killed her mother. But had Eleanor Wright's quest for justice crossed the line into attempted murder? Miss Marple knew from long experience that grief and anger could drive people to actions they would never have contemplated in calmer circumstances. The question was whether Eleanor's pain over her stepmother's death had led her to poison Geoffrey Blackwell's throat lozenges, and if so, whether she had intended to kill him or merely incapacitate him long enough to present her evidence. The timing was significant. The poisoning had occurred just 3 weeks before the Christmas concert, the same concert after which Mrs. Fletcher, Timothy Hartley and Mrs. Pemberton had planned to present their own evidence of embezzlement. Had Eleanor Wright feared being preempted in her exposure of Blackwell, or had she simply reached a breaking point, unable to watch him conduct one more rehearsal, unable to hear him make one more decision about the choir that should have featured her stepmother's voice at Canterbury Cathedral? Miss Marple understood that she would need to approach Eleanor Wright with great care and compassion. This was not a case of simple malice or greed-motivated violence. It was a tragedy of grief transformed into rage, of justice sought through methods that had nearly resulted in murder. The truth would need to be handled delicately, with attention to the very real pain that had motivated Eleanor's actions. Chapter 6. The Botanical Reference and Throat Irritation. Miss Marple's next observation came during a casual visit to the church on a Friday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss flower arrangements for Sunday's service. She found Miss Wright in the choir room, as she had expected, organising music for the weekend's practice. What caught her attention immediately was the condition of Miss Wright's throat. The assistant director's voice was noticeably hoarse, and she kept clearing her throat in a way that suggested considerable discomfort. When Miss Marple expressed polite concern, Miss Wright explained that she had been suffering from a persistent sore throat for the past 2 weeks, blaming it on the cold weather and the dusty conditions in the choir room. However, Miss Marple noticed that Miss Wright's throat irritation appeared to be more severe than a simple cold would warrant. The skin around her neck showed signs of redness and inflammation, and she winced noticeably when swallowing her tea. More telling still was Miss Wright's careful avoidance of anything acidic or spicy in her refreshments, declining Miss Marple's offer of lemon in her tea and pushing away the ginger biscuits that usually accompanied their conversations. A chance encounter with Dr. Haydock that evening provided additional context. The doctor mentioned in the course of general conversation that he had treated several cases of unusual throat irritation in recent weeks. Most puzzling was that the symptoms didn't match any common illness, but rather resembled chemical burns of the mucous membranes. He had been consulting reference books on toxicology to understand the pattern. This information aligned perfectly with something Miss Marple had noticed in Miss Wright's handbag during their Thursday encounter in the choir room. Among the usual items one might expect, she had glimpsed the spine of a book that seemed out of place, a botanical reference guide with a section on poisonous plants and their medical applications. The book's cover had shown signs of recent and repeated use. Miss Marple's suspicions were further confirmed when she visited the library in Much Benham, where she learned from the librarian that Miss Wright had been a frequent visitor over the past several months. She had checked out numerous books on chemistry, toxicology, and medicinal plants. The librarian remembered particularly because Miss Wright had asked specific questions about extracting and concentrating natural compounds, claiming she was working on a project to create natural throat lozenges for the choir. This pattern suggested something both calculated and deeply concerning. Miss Wright had clearly been researching methods of creating a throat irritant, and the state of her own throat indicated that she had been testing her preparations on herself. This was not the action of someone planning a simple poisoning, but rather someone trying to calibrate a precise dosage. Miss Marple recalled Dr. Haydock's explanation of the poison used on Mr. Blackwell. It had been a concentrated solution of capsaicin, the compound that makes peppers hot, mixed with certain oils to create a substance that would dissolve slowly on the tongue and cause severe inflammation of the throat and airways. The preparation required both chemical knowledge and careful testing to achieve the right potency. The question that troubled Miss Marple most was one of intent. Had Eleanor Wright meant to kill Geoffrey Blackwell, or had she been trying to create a substance that would merely incapacitate him temporarily? The testing on herself suggested she was trying to find a non-lethal dose, one that would cause sufficient distress to prevent Blackwell from interfering while Eleanor presented her evidence to the vicar. However, there was something Miss Wright had apparently not known and could not have predicted. Geoffrey Blackwell's underlying heart condition. Dr. Haydock had mentioned in confidence that Blackwell suffered from an undiagnosed cardiac weakness that had made the throat irritant far more dangerous than it would have been for a healthy person. The combination of the chemical burn, the resulting panic, and the strain on his compromised heart had very nearly proven fatal. This medical detail cast Eleanor Wright's actions in a different light. If she had tested the poison on herself and found it painful but survivable, she might well have believed it would merely incapacitate Blackwell long enough for her to expose his crimes. She could not have known that his heart condition would transform her calculated act of temporary incapacitation into near murder. Miss Marple found this possibility both troubling and somehow more comprehensible than cold-blooded murder. It suggested a woman who had been driven by grief and anger to seek justice through illegal means, but who had not actually intended to kill. Yet the law, Miss Marple knew, would not necessarily distinguish between attempted murder and reckless endangerment resulting in near-fatal harm. As she sat in her garden that evening, Miss Marple reflected on the complexity of moral judgment. Eleanor Wright had clearly committed a serious crime in poisoning Geoffrey Blackwell's throat lozenges, but she had done so while believing she was administering a temporary punishment that would allow her to expose a far more serious and prolonged crime. The fact that it had nearly resulted in Blackwell's death was due to a medical condition Eleanor had no way of knowing about. Still, ignorance of a victim's medical condition was not a defense for poisoning, and Miss Marple knew that Eleanor Wright would have to face the consequences of her actions. The question was how to bring the truth to light in a way that acknowledged both the crime and the very real injustice that had motivated it. Chapter 7. The conversation about medical history. Miss Marple's final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source, her own memory of a conversation that had occurred 3 months earlier, well before the poisoning incident. It was the sort of casual exchange that usually passes without notice, but which Miss Marple's habit of careful observation had preserved in remarkable detail. The conversation had taken place at a church social in September, when the choir was just beginning its preparation for the Christmas concert. Eleanor Wright had been serving tea and making polite conversation with various members of the congregation. Miss Marple, always interested in human behaviour, had noticed how Eleanor's conversation seemed to follow a particular pattern with certain individuals. When speaking with Mr. Blackwell himself, Eleanor had expressed concern about the demands of the upcoming concert season. She had asked with apparent casualness whether he felt the rehearsal schedule might be too strenuous. Was he taking care of his health? Did he ever experience shortness of breath during the long rehearsals? These seemed like the questions of a concerned assistant director, solicitous about her supervisor's well-being. But Miss Marple, reflecting on this conversation in light of recent events, realized there had been something more purposeful about Eleanor's inquiries. She had been particularly interested in Mr. Blackwell's response to stress, his reactions to unexpected difficulties, his general physical resilience. At the time, Miss Marple had thought Eleanor might be worried about taking over directorship if Mr. Blackwell fell ill. Now she understood the questions had a far more sinister purpose. Eleanor Wright had been assessing whether Geoffrey Blackwell would survive her planned poisoning. She had been trying to determine, through careful and seemingly innocent questions, whether he had any underlying health conditions that might make the throat irritant more dangerous than she intended. The fact that Mr. Blackwell had brushed off these concerns, insisting he was in perfect health and never saw doctors unless absolutely necessary, had apparently convinced Eleanor that her plan would work as intended. This realization troubled Miss Marple deeply. It suggested that Eleanor Wright had been planning the poisoning for months, not acting in a moment of passion but carefully calculating how to incapacitate Blackwell without killing him. The extended timeline made the crime more serious, removing any possibility of claiming temporary insanity or uncontrollable rage. Yet there was something else in Eleanor's behaviour that interested Miss Marple. The questions about health had been asked not just of Mr. Blackwell but of others as well. Eleanor had inquired about Colonel Bantry's heart condition, about Dr. Haydock's views on stress-related illness, about various choir members' experiences with throat ailments and breathing difficulties. It was as though she were gathering a comprehensive understanding of how the human body responded to various forms of stress and chemical irritation. Miss Marple decided the time had come for a direct conversation. She invited Eleanor Wright to tea on Monday afternoon, a casual invitation that Eleanor accepted with apparent pleasure. The two women sat in Miss Marple's comfortable sitting room, teacups balanced on delicate china, while rain drummed against the windows and the fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth. They spoke of pleasant things at first, the upcoming Christmas concert, the weather, the various goings-on in St. Mary Mead. But Miss Marple, with the gentle persistence that had served her so well in previous investigations, gradually steered the conversation toward more significant matters. She mentioned how interesting it was that Eleanor had taken such an interest in medical matters over the past year. Had she considered studying nursing or medicine? Eleanor's response was carefully non-committal, but Miss Marple noticed how her hands tightened around her teacup and how her gaze dropped to her lap. Then Miss Marple mentioned the botanical reference book she had glimpsed in Eleanor's bag and the library visits that had focused on toxicology and plant chemistry. She remarked in her mild way how thorough Eleanor had been in her research, how carefully she had tested her preparations on herself before administering them to anyone else. Eleanor Wright's teacup rattled in its saucer as her hands began to tremble. For a long moment she said nothing, simply staring at the fire as though seeking answers in its flickering depths. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She had known, Eleanor said quietly, that she needed to understand exactly what would happen. She couldn't risk killing Mr. Blackwell, despite everything he had done. That wasn't justice. That was murder. She had spent months researching, testing small amounts on herself to gauge the effects, calculating dosages that would cause severe distress but not permanent harm. What she hadn't known, what she couldn't have known, was that Geoffrey Blackwell's heart was weak. He had always presented himself as robust and healthy, dismissing any suggestion of vulnerability. If she had known about his cardiac condition, Eleanor insisted, she would never have proceeded with her plan. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her expression one of sympathetic attention. When Eleanor finished speaking, tears streaming down her face, Miss Marple asked gently about the documentation Eleanor had been compiling. What had she intended to do with all those photographs of financial records? Eleanor explained that she had been building a comprehensive case against Mr. Blackwell, one that would be impossible to refute or dismiss. She had planned to incapacitate him during Thursday's rehearsal, then present her evidence to Reverend Clement, while Blackwell was unable to interfere or destroy records. The throat irritant was meant to keep him temporarily voiceless and weak, giving her time to ensure justice was served. Her stepmother's death, Eleanor continued, had broken something inside her. Catherine Wright had died believing her dream was impossible, believing there was no money for Canterbury when in fact there had been plenty. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was spiritual. It had stolen hope from a dying woman, and Eleanor could not forgive that. Miss Marple understood the depth of that pain, but she also understood the law. Eleanor Wright had attempted to poison Geoffrey Blackwell, and regardless of her intentions or her ignorance of his medical condition, she would have to face the consequences of her actions. The question was how to ensure that both crimes, the embezzlement and the poisoning, received appropriate attention from the authorities. Chapter 8. The comprehensive documentation revealed. The following morning, Miss Marple accompanied Eleanor Wright to the police station in Much Benham. Inspector Slack, summoned from his usual duties, listened with growing incredulity as Eleanor presented the complete documentation of Geoffrey Blackwell's embezzlement. The evidence was remarkable in its thoroughness. Eleanor had compiled hundreds of photographs of financial records, cross-referenced with bank statements, donation receipts, and concert proceeds spanning 5 years. She had created detailed spreadsheets showing the pattern of theft, highlighting every discrepancy between reported and actual income. She had even obtained statements from several major donors, confirming the amounts they had given and the purposes for which those donations were intended. The Canterbury Cathedral Fund was documented with particular care. Eleanor had copies of her stepmother's donation cheque, the church's receipt acknowledging the gift, and the bank records showing that the money had never been deposited into the choir account. She had correspondence from Canterbury Cathedral confirming the invitation and the estimated costs, proving that sufficient funds had been raised for the trip. Most damning was Eleanor's discovery of a second bank account in Blackwell's name, one he had opened at a bank in London where he thought local scrutiny would be minimal. Through patient investigation and the help of a friend who worked in banking, Eleanor had obtained records showing regular deposits into this account that precisely matched the amounts missing from the choir fund. Inspector Slack examined the documentation with increasing seriousness. This was not the work of a moment's passion, but months of careful investigation. Eleanor Wright had built a case that would have stood up in any court of law. The question was why she had felt the need to supplement this overwhelming evidence with attempted murder. Eleanor's explanation, delivered in a steady voice despite her obvious distress, focused on timing and opportunity. She had known that Mrs. Fletcher, Timothy Hartley and Mrs. Pemberton were conducting their own investigation. She had feared that if they presented their evidence first, Blackwell would somehow escape full accountability, perhaps through legal manoeuvring or by claiming ignorance of financial details. More importantly, Eleanor had wanted to ensure that everyone understood the human cost of Blackwell's crimes. The theft wasn't just about money, it was about broken dreams and stolen hope. It was about her stepmother dying heartbroken because of a lie. Eleanor had wanted Blackwell to suffer, even briefly, the way Catherine Wright had suffered in her final months. Inspector Slack, however, was more interested in the mechanics of the poisoning. How had Eleanor gained access to Blackwell's throat lozenges? She explained about borrowing her father's church warden keys, about arriving early on Thursday evenings to access the locked desk. She had replaced 3 of Blackwell's medicated lozenges with her own prepared versions, leaving enough untainted ones that he might not consume a poisoned lozenge immediately. The preparation itself had been created using concentrated capsaicin, extracted from several pounds of the hottest peppers available, mixed with oils that would help it dissolve slowly and spread throughout the throat. Eleanor had tested increasingly, strong dilutions on herself over several weeks, using the resulting irritation to gauge what dosage might incapacitate without causing permanent harm. What she hadn't accounted for was individual variation in response to the compound, or the possibility that Blackwell might have underlying health conditions that would make him more vulnerable. She had assumed that because she survived the test doses, Blackwell would as well. It was a miscalculation that had very nearly resulted in his death. Inspector Slack informed Eleanor that she would be charged with attempted murder, though he acknowledged that her evidence against Blackwell would certainly be taken into account. The comprehensive documentation she had compiled would be forwarded to the appropriate authorities for investigation of the embezzlement charges. As they prepared to formalize Eleanor's arrest, Miss Marple asked if she might speak with the inspector privately. In the quiet of his office, she raised questions about the complexity of Eleanor's situation. This was a woman who had uncovered serious crimes and had been driven to desperate action by grief and the failure of proper channels to protect the vulnerable. Surely that deserved some consideration. Chapter 9. The Breaking Point and Mother's Memory. Inspector Slack agreed to delay the formal charges for 24 hours, giving Miss Marple time to gather additional context that might help the court understand Eleanor Wright's actions more fully. Miss Marple used this time to speak with those who had known Catherine Wright and could testify to the impact of Blackwell's theft on her final months. Mrs. Pemberton proved a valuable witness. She had been Catherine Wright's closest friend and had visited her regularly during her illness. She described how Catherine had lived for the Canterbury performance, how she had pushed herself through chemotherapy sessions by imagining herself standing in that magnificent cathedral, her voice rising to those ancient rafters. The announcement that the trip was cancelled had been devastating. According to Mrs. Pemberton, Catherine had visibly given up after that news. She stopped attending physical therapy, stopped taking her medications regularly, stopped fighting. Within weeks, her condition had deteriorated dramatically. The doctors had been puzzled by the rapid decline, but Mrs. Pemberton understood it perfectly. Catherine had lost her reason to keep fighting, and without that hope, she had simply let go. Eleanor had been with her stepmother constantly during those final weeks. Mrs. Pemberton recalled how Eleanor had tried desperately to rally Catherine's spirits, suggesting other goals and dreams to pursue, but nothing had worked. Catherine had wanted Canterbury, had saved for Canterbury, had dreamed of Canterbury. Without that possibility, life had simply lost its meaning for her. The memorial service for Catherine had been held in the church, with the choir singing her favourite hymns. Geoffrey Blackwell had conducted with his usual precision, showing no sign of awareness that his theft had contributed to her death. Eleanor had sat in the front pew watching him direct the music, and something inside her had broken irrevocably. Miss Marple also spoke with Reverend Clement, who provided additional insight into Eleanor's state of mind over the past 3 years. He had noticed her growing bitterness toward Mr. Blackwell, her increasingly sharp comments about financial management, her barely concealed anger whenever the Canterbury trip was mentioned. He had attributed it to grief and had given her space to work through her feelings. What the vicar hadn't realized was that Eleanor had been conducting her investigation during all that time. She had been systematically gathering evidence while maintaining her position as assistant choir director, working alongside the man she held responsible for her stepmother's death. The strain of that double life had taken an obvious toll on her health and temperament. Dr. Haydock provided medical context about the effects of prolonged grief and stress on decision-making. He explained how Eleanor's repeated self-testing with the throat irritant had likely affected her judgment, the pain and discomfort clouding her ability to think clearly about consequences. Combined with her overwhelming desire for justice, this had created conditions where poisoning Blackwell seemed not just reasonable, but necessary. Most tellingly, Miss Marple discovered Eleanor's private journal, which Eleanor voluntarily surrendered as part of her statement to police. The journal documented her emotional journey from grief to anger to the decision to act. Entry after entry described her internal struggle between seeking justice through proper channels and taking matters into her own hands. One passage was particularly revealing, dated 2 weeks before the poisoning. "I have all the evidence I need to destroy him legally. But will that be enough? Will it make people understand what he took from Mother? Will it make him suffer even a fraction of what she suffered? I don't want him in prison. I want him to feel the panic, the helplessness, the loss of voice and breath that Mother felt in her final days." This entry made clear that Eleanor had not intended murder, but rather a symbolic punishment that would mirror Catherine's suffering. She had wanted Blackwell to experience temporarily what her stepmother had endured permanently, the inability to breathe, to speak, to sing. It was revenge, certainly, but revenge carefully calibrated to educate rather than kill. Inspector Slack, reviewing all this information, began to see the case in more nuanced terms. This was not a cold-blooded attempt at murder, but rather a grief-stricken woman's desperate attempt to achieve justice when proper channels seemed inadequate. The fact remained that she had poisoned someone and very nearly killed him, but the context mattered significantly for how the courts would view her actions. Chapter 10. Justice for all parties concerned. The resolution of the case required careful balancing of competing interests and moral considerations. Geoffrey Blackwell, having recovered sufficiently to speak, was formally charged with embezzlement and fraud. The evidence Eleanor Wright had compiled, combined with Colonel Bantry's independent audit, and the statements from Mrs. Fletcher, Timothy Hartley, and Mrs. Pemberton, left no room for denial. Blackwell attempted to minimize his crimes, claiming the missing money had been used for choir-related expenses that he had simply failed to document properly. However, the existence of his secret London bank account and the luxury purchases traced to his personal use demolished this defence. He had stolen systematically and deliberately, enriching himself while lying to people who trusted him with funds donated in memory of their loved ones. The revelation of Blackwell's crimes prompted an outpouring of anger and betrayal from the St. Mary Mead community. Many people had donated generously to the choir fund over the years, and learning that their money had been stolen was deeply painful. The cancelled Canterbury trip was particularly galling, as so many had contributed specifically for that purpose, inspired by Catherine Wright's devotion and excitement. Eleanor Wright's case was more complicated. She was charged with attempted murder, but her attorney argued for reduced charges based on several mitigating factors. First, the extensive documentation proved she had been trying to expose serious crimes through legitimate means. Second, her testing of the poison on herself demonstrated intent to calibrate a non-lethal dose. Third, her ignorance of Blackwell's heart condition meant she could not have predicted the severity of his reaction. Most significantly, psychiatric evaluation revealed that Eleanor had been suffering from complicated grief and depression since her stepmother's death, conditions that had been exacerbated by discovering that Catherine's suffering had been caused by preventable theft. While this didn't excuse her actions, it provided context for understanding how a normally law-abiding woman had been driven to such desperate measures. Miss Marple testified on Eleanor's behalf, carefully explaining the sequence of discoveries and decisions that had led to the poisoning. She emphasized that Eleanor had spent months trying to find a way to expose Blackwell without resorting to violence. It was only when she feared her evidence might be preempted or dismissed that she had taken the drastic step of poisoning the throat lozenges. The judge, after careful consideration, accepted a plea agreement. Eleanor Wright was convicted of reckless endangerment rather than attempted murder, acknowledging that she had not intended to kill Blackwell, but had created a dangerous situation through her actions. She received a suspended sentence with probation, required to perform community service and continue psychiatric treatment. Crucially, the judge also ordered that Eleanor's compiled evidence be used in full in the prosecution of Geoffrey Blackwell, and that her role in exposing his crimes be formally acknowledged. This meant that Catherine Wright's story, the stolen dreams and the broken hope, became part of the official record of Blackwell's trial. Geoffrey Blackwell was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to repay all stolen funds with interest. The money recovered was used to finally fulfill Catherine Wright's dream, funding a memorial concert at Canterbury Cathedral, where the St. Mary Mead Choir, under Eleanor Wright's direction, performed in Catherine's honour. The case forced St. Mary Mead's church community to reckon with how they had given Geoffrey Blackwell unchecked power for so many years. New financial oversight procedures were implemented, requiring quarterly audits and shared authority over church funds. The choir fund was restructured with a board of trustees, including choir members, ensuring that no single person could control donations and expenditures. Miss Marple, reflecting on the case in the quiet of her cottage garden, understood that justice had been served imperfectly but appropriately. Eleanor Wright had committed a serious crime, driven by unbearable grief to actions she would never have contemplated in other circumstances. She would carry the consequences of her choices, but she had also exposed serious wrongs and ensured that her stepmother's memory was honoured. The true tragedy, Miss Marple reflected, was how preventable it all had been. If proper financial oversight had been in place, Blackwell's theft would have been discovered years earlier. If Catherine Wright's donated funds had been properly protected, her dream trip to Canterbury would have happened, and she might have found the will to fight her illness more successfully. If Eleanor had felt confident that official channels would deliver justice, she might never have resorted to poisoning. In the end, St. Mary Mead's choir continued, now under Eleanor Wright's permanent direction. The Christmas concert that year was dedicated to Catherine Wright's memory, with all proceeds going to a new fund supporting terminally ill choir members' final wishes. The community had learned painful lessons about oversight, accountability, and the human cost of unchecked authority. Miss Marple resumed her place in the alto section, third from the left in the second row, her knitting needles clicking softly during breaks in rehearsal, her keen eyes still observing the endless complexities of human nature in her beloved village.